Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Standing before you is Algrian Lovu, the group leader of the STARS group. Now, it is an honor to be given such an opportunity to present about the most prestigious topic, the Bantu Education Act. Now, as my team member would further elaborate, the Bantu Education Act was passed by South Africa in 1953, but took effect in 1954, the 1st of January. The law governed the education of the black children who were called Bantu by the government at the time. Now, during the apartheid era, the government allowed social segregation and prejudice against non-whites in the country. Then in the 1930s, black students were typically enrolled in schools that were managed by the religious missionary, which was provided funding by the government, because many students, of course, attended these schools. Then in 1949, the government selected an anthropologist by the name of Iselin to lead a commission. Iselin was assigned a task to propose ways as to how we can educate the indigenous people of South Africa. Now, the Iselin Commission report urged the government to take responsibility for the Black South Africa's education as part of... Now, the Iselin Commission report urged the government to take responsibility for Black South Africa's education as part of an overarching socio-economic scheme. The Bantu education mostly adhered to the instructions given to them by the Commission. As a result, black children were obliged to attend government schools by the legislation. The education was designed to instill the notion that black individuals should accept their subordinate status to white South Africans. The communities that were being served at that time were paying taxes, which contributed to the funding of the schools, and black schools received less funding compared to white schools. In the beginning, high schools were concentrated in the Bantustans, which were reserved by the government as homelands for black South Africans. In the 1970s, high schools were established in Soweto outside of Johannesburg in response to the demand for black skilled workers to also receive educational training. The extension of University Act 1959 further prevented black individuals from attending or enrolling in open universities. The Education and Training Act took place of the Bantu Education Act during the time. The South African Schools Act of 1996 put an end to the compulsory separation between white students and black students.
Good day, my name is Taha, and today I'll be explaining more about Bantu education and when it was implemented. The Bantu Education Act, Act number 47 of 1953, later renamed the Black Education Act, which is the BEA, was the South African racial segregation law that legislated several aspects of apartheid system. Bantu education. In 1953, the government passed the Bantu education, and people were not happy about it. They didn't want bad education for their children. The Bantu Education Act, the South African law, enacted in 1953 and in effect in 1954, January 1st, that governed the education of black South African children, which the country's government called the Bantu. It was also part of the government's apartheid system that allows the racial segregation and discrimination of non-whites in the country. It was implemented so that the white government could more effectively control the black schools. This allowed the government to further their agenda of creating a state apartheid or a total racial segregation. This act allowed the government to drain money away from the black schools and to develop a curricula that supported the apartheid system. The system of discrimination and oppression in South Africa, known as apartheid, was implemented and enforced by many laws and other acts. This legislation served to institutionalize a racial segregation. This legislation served to institutionalize racial discrimination and dominance by white people over people of other races. While the bulk of this legislation enacted after the election of the National Party government in 1948, it preceded by discriminatory legislation enacted under earlier British and Afrikaner governments.
Good day everyone, I go by the name and surname of Emma Ramoroka, and I'm here to do a presentation about the Bantu Education Act. The question is, who came up with the Bantu Education Act? In 1953, the South African government passed the Bantu Education Act into law, and this gave government the power to structure the education of native South African children. The Bantu Education Act was created by the National Party government of South Africa in 1953. The government provided a legislative framework for the department. Under the Act, Hendrik Verwoerd was made the head of Department for Native Affairs and was therefore made responsible for the education of black students. The Act was formally established in 1958 and it required black children to attend government schools. The Bantu Education Act was apartheid's most offensive, racist and oppressive law. The Bantu Education Act created a separate inferior education for black students, and its purpose was to make sure that black South African students would only ever work as semi-skilled or unskilled, even though they were intelligent enough to become skilled. The Bantu Education Act led to many protests such as the Soweto uprising. The act was the result of the Excellent Commission report, a report published in 1951 about the state of education in South Africa. Racial segregation in education became mandatory under the act. Most African schools were run by missionaries, and therefore the Bantu Education Act favored the whites and not the blacks.
Good day, my name is Ngakwana Mutibi and I'm here to talk about the disadvantage of Bantu education. In other words, I'll be demonstrating how Bantu education restricted the opportunity of black South African educational and socio-economically during apartheid between 1948 till 1994, which have resulted in lack of job for black South Africans. Here are the disadvantages of Bantu education, and I'll be discussing each disadvantage and how it affected the life of black South Africans. Number 1, the lack of funding and expenditure. Bantu education in South Africa leads to lack of funding and expenditure in black students in their designated school, detrimentally affected their access to employment and socio-economically opportunities. The lack of teacher training. The lack of teacher training and number of teachers in school during apartheid contributed to the restricted access in South African employment. For an example, in black school, there were lack of maths and physical science teachers, and due to there not being enough qualified teachers for teaching mathematics, black South African schools were deprived from foundation subjects in education under apartheid. The education and curriculum. By creating specialty curriculum that promote unskilled labor in black schools, and this also restricted the opportunity of black South African in skilled employment. And the curriculum of Bantu education under apartheid trained black South African students to work as unskilled labor, such as craft gardens. And furthermore, with curriculum neither be too long or confusing, and this prevented teachers from applying or teaching students a fully and holistic education. And black students were to receive education that would have led them to inspire to positions that they would not hold in the society. Instead, they were to receive education designed to promote skills to serve their own homeland or work as a labour job for poor quality conditions and facilities. Bantu education's lack of fixing school conditions was detriment in education quality, as it distracted students from learning important concepts that would have helped them in the future. And by not providing fair school conditions in black South African students, this also prevented students from learning important skills that would have helped them in the future employment. The lack of vocational and technical school. By not providing adequate vocational and technical school in black South African students, and also preventing them from enrolling or attending institutions that provide job or vocational training, and this also restricted students from applying or obtaining skilled employment. Less qualified teachers. Only 10% of teachers were matriculated during apartheid in 1967. And Bantu education was essential inferior of education, whereby teachers were less qualified than students. Thank you.
Good day, my name is Lak Mpangani. I'm here to present the advantages of the Bantu Education Act. The implementation of the Bantu Education Act became an advantage to black South African people and benefited them in a very good way. The Bantu Education Act taught black South African children to be obedient and to think practically. More and more money was spent on black South African schools than schools of other races. The Bantu Education Act led to a substantial increase on the government funding on learning institutions. The Bantu Education Act opened more opportunities for more black South African children to go to school. The Bantu Education Act empowered black South African people through education. The Bantu Education Act improved the performance of black South African children and also the performance of teachers, and as well the quality of black South African teachers. The Bantu Education Act improved the infrastructure of black South African schools. The law forced the learning institution to be under direct control of the state, and this led to the National Party to have power to employ and train teachers as it saw fit. The learning environment of black South African children became more friendly. Thank you.
Good day, my name is Sharon, and I'll be doing Why Did Bantu Education Came to an End? The Bantu Education Act was repealed and replaced by a new law in 1979, which went into effect on the 1st of January 1980. From the beginning of the desire for home rule and independence in South Africa, the white minority, English, Dutch, German, and Hagnat obtained political power, and they did everything they could to maintain that control. In the beginning, they passed laws disfranchising the majority population and forcing them to give up their farms and move to cities to work. In 1948, the South African government implemented apartheid, which called for a complete separation of races in South Africa. In 1915, white only allowed white students to attend open universities, which kept the other races from legitimate colleges and universities. Attempts were made to have some closed universities, but funding was difficult. Following the Soweto uprising, restriction of the Bantu Education Act were loosened with the passage of the Education and Training Act of 1979. The Act still called for the segregated schools, and this law remained in place until 1990s. Segregation became unconstitutional after introduction of the interim constitution in 1994, and most sections of the Education and Training Act repealed by the South African Schools Act 1996. The Bantu Education Act created a separate inferior education system for black students. The purpose of this act was to make sure that black South Africans would only be able to work as unskilled, semi-skilled laborers, even if they were intelligent enough to become skilled. This kept them the servants to the white, black, mixed, and Asians. Since the white ruled the government, they implemented policy to continue their chokehold on power. In the field of education, the South African government did not want to deny education to the black majority, but they only wanted them educated enough to work for them. In order to do this, the National Party passed the Bantu Education Act in 1953, and they implemented it on January 1st, 1954. The law permanently segregated schools in South Africa, and it forced the black South Africans to attend government-funded schools. While these schools were taught in native tongues, they only prepared blacks for menial jobs in South Africa. And as a result, educational needs grew to semi-skilled labor. South Africa's government created high schools